Thank you, Chris Amundsen and the Office of NASBE for all your support and for bringing me here today for this amazing opportunity. It is now the greatest honor of my life to introduce to you Mr. Saul Khan.
Thank you so much for that. That was, I don't know, I've never gotten kind of chills while having an introduction. But thank you, Jonathan. That means a ton to not just me, but the whole team at Khan Academy and the College Board and many others. Well, you know, what I want to do is really just give a sense of Khan Academy, what we're trying to do, and then we'll talk about the partnership with the College Board and answer y'all's questions. But I like to start these types of presentations just getting a sense of how familiar y'all are. How many of you have used Khan Academy with your children? Oh, good number. How many of you have used it yourself? How many of you before today really didn't know much about Khan Academy? Okay, good, that's why we're here. So a lot of people who are somewhat familiar associate us with a collection of videos, and that is part of Khan Academy. But you'll see that we're much, much more than that. But just to get on the same page, let me show you this montage of videos.
This is an age right after Isaac Newton.
I'm told the humidity makes it feel hot. Why is this?
Excellent question, LeBron.
And you can just see the pleasure he had.
The right to privacy as such is not spelled out in the Constitution. Of course, the word liberty is.
Things actually can interbreed, although for these two in particular, it seems like the mechanics would be.
Keep playing around with these numbers and see what kind of colors I can come up with.
If this does not blow your mind, then you have no emotion.
Glad you all like Euler's identity. As I mentioned, it's much more than videos. This is just some screenshots of the software on Khan Academy where a student can go on whatever skill they want to learn. This is, a screenshot of calculus. A teacher can assign those skills and then get data on where the students are, maybe differentiate instruction. It's not just in the sciences and math. This is something in world history. And we'll talk more about the partnership with College Board, but it's really across subjects and grades. We want it so that any student can start where they, at the beginning, at a kindergarten level, and get as far as they need to go. Ideally, it's happening in conjunction with the classroom, but also even for students who might not have access to a certain course or might not have access to a classroom at all. So this is just a snapshot of where Khan Academy is right now. It's being used in some way, shape, or form in almost every country in the world. Over 2 million educators using it, over 55 million registered students. Just our 30 cents per hour of learning, which is about 1/100th the cost of what it typically takes to get tutoring or something like that. It's only going down as things scale up. And put everything in perspective and how surreal it is even for me to hear stories like Jonathan's and to think about numbers like this. I'll give you a little bit of background on how all of this got started. You rewind about 13 years now. My original background was in math and in technology, but I go to business school. I'm a new analyst at an investment firm in Boston. I just get married. My family is visiting me from New Orleans for my wedding. And it just comes out of conversation that my 12-year-old cousin Nadia is having trouble with math. It's unit conversion, and because of that, she's placed into a remedial math class. I think it's a pretty serious issue. I offer to tutor her. She agrees. She goes back to New Orleans. And then over the next few weeks, I just get on the phone. We use instant messenger to just work together. She slowly but surely got unit conversion. She gets caught up with her class. She gets a little bit ahead of her class. At that point, I became what I call a tiger cousin. And I called up her school. And I'm sure educators here appreciate these calls. And I said, I really think Nadia Rahman should retake that placement exam from last year. They said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. And they let her take it. And the same Nadia who was being placed in a remedial math class was now put into an advanced math class. So I view that as a pretty neat victory, small intervention on my part. I start tutoring her younger brothers. And then over the next 18 months or so, word gets around the family that free tutoring is going on. And so I find myself with about 10, 15 cousins, family, friends. Every day after work, I'd get on the speakerphone and try to email them all, and I was working with them all as their tutors. And I saw a common pattern already that a lot of them just had gaps in their knowledge, that they were struggling with algebra not because algebra was difficult, but because they had a gap in the 5th grade decimals or 7th grade negative numbers. And so the first Khan Academy, I actually started writing software for them. It had nothing to do with videos, where they could get as much practice as necessary. I, as their tutor or their teacher, could get a good readout on what their gaps were. And in 2006, I was showing this off at a dinner party, and the host of the party says, well, this is all cool, Sal, but how are you actually scaling up your lessons? And I said, no, it's a good point. It's much harder to do with 10 or 15 cousins than I was doing with one. And Zuli, I have to give him full credit, he said, well, why don't you record some of your lessons as videos and upload them onto YouTube for your family? And I immediately said, no, that's a horrible idea. YouTube is for cats playing piano. It is not for serious mathematics. But I go home that weekend, I get over the idea that it wasn't my idea, and I decide to give it a shot. And I just make videos on the things that I saw myself explaining over and over again to my family. And I told them, hey, why don't you watch this at your own time and pace, and then when we get on the phone, we can dig a little bit deeper. After about a month, I asked for feedback, and they famously told me they liked me better on YouTube than in person. And it's counterintuitive at first until you really put yourself in the shoes of a learner. They weren't saying that they didn't appreciate me in their life. We just heard an incredible story about the importance of a human being who motivates, who mentors. But what they were saying is, and we've all been there, the first time you're trying to learn something and you're a little bit stressed, it's stressful when even a well-intentioned tutor or family member is waiting for you to learn it. Oh, it's just easy, the x equals 5, it's easy, right? And you feel pressure, oh yeah. But you might have some gaps, you might feel embarrassed, you might be in an algebra class and you're embarrassed about your 5th grade deficiencies, you're in a calculus class, you're embarrassed about your algebra deficiencies. But now there is no judgment, you get it at your own time and pace, you can get the explanations when you want to, in the middle of the night if necessary. And so I took it as positive feedback, kept going. It soon became clear that people who were not my cousins were watching. View count started to go up. Comments started to come in. Some of those initial comments were just simple thank yous. Even that I thought was a pretty big deal. I don't know how much time you spend on YouTube. Most of the comments are not thank you. They're a little edgier. But then they got more intense. I got comments, this is the reason I was able to pass my algebra class. This is the reason why I didn't drop out of high school. In the early days, there was this mother who sent an email. And I brought my wife over. I was like, this is incredible. She said that both of her sons had a learning disability, and these videos were the only way that they could keep up in class. And because of that, her and her entire family were praying for me and my entire family every night. And so you can imagine how especially intense that was for me. You have to remember, I was an analyst at a hedge fund. I was not used to people praying for me, at least in that way. And so I kept going. You fast forward to 2009, there were about 50 to 100,000 people who were using this thing that still was a hobby. And I was waking up in the morning and, instead of my day job, I was more concerned about reading requests or testimonials from people all over the world. And, my wife and I, we said, there feels like there's something here. The social return on investment could be through the charts. So set it up as a not-for-profit. And we had a little bit of savings. Our first child had just been born, but it's kind of like, surely I could quit my job and someone will come to support this. And I did. And when you do anything entrepreneurial, you almost have to start with that delusional optimism, whether it's for-profit or not-profit. And for me, it was similar. I jump into it, and then you start having meetings with folks, and they say, well, this is great, but it's not exactly what we fund, or our budget's allocated this year. And about 7-8 months into it, it was incredibly stressful. We were digging into our savings. About $5,000 a month. What was a down payment on the house was shrinking quickly. It's fun to think about it now, but at the time, it was definitely the most stressful time in my life. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat. What have I done to my family, et cetera, et cetera. And at around that time, I was getting some donations off of PayPal. It was amounting to about $100 a month. If it was any of you, thank you. But right at May of 2010, all of a sudden a $10,000 donation came in. So I immediately see who it is. Her name was Ann Doerr. I immediately email her. And I say, thank you so much for this incredibly generous donation. This is the largest donation that Khan Academy has ever received. If we were a physical school, you would now have a building named after you. And Ann immediately responded back and said, well, tell me, I'd love to meet, I'm local. By this point, we had moved out to California. So a week later, we're having lunch, and Ann asks me, so what's your goal here? And I told her, when I filled out the paperwork with the IRS to be a nonprofit, there's a part where you have to fill out your mission, and I filled out a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And Ann said, well, that's ambitious. How do you see yourself doing that? And I told her, to be clear, it's a mission. I don't plan on just being able to check it off this weekend and then move on to healthcare or something. Have some ideas. But I showed her, she was familiar with the videos. I showed her the screenshots of the software. I said, look, it's not, I would internationalize everything. I would make tools for teachers. I already had some primitive ones that I was using. I showed her the notebook of testimonials from students around the world. And Ann says, well, you've made a surprising amount of progress. I only have one question. How are you supporting yourself? And in as proud of a way as possible, I said, I'm not. And so she processes that. We part ways. 10 minutes later, I'm driving into my driveway, and I get a text message from Ann, and it says, you really need to be supporting yourself. I've just wired you $100,000. So that was a good day. That was a little bit. And then frankly, that was the beginning, kind of like Jonathan's story, a cascade of more and crazier events. A month later, I was running a summer camp with middle school students, running a market simulation, when all of a sudden I start getting text messages from Ann, which you can imagine I now take very seriously. And there were 5 or 6 of them. They were kind of cryptic, but they read along the lines, this is Ann writing, I'm at the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm in the main pavilion. Bill Gates on stage. Last 5 minutes talking about Khan Academy. So I didn't know what to make of this. I immediately boot the nearest 7th grader off of a computer, and I start looking for some evidence of this event, and I finally found it, and this is what I saw.
There's a new website that I've just been using with my kids recently called Khan Academy, K-H-A-N. Just one guy doing some unbelievable 15-minute tutorials. My favorite thing yet is that guy, Salman Khan. He was a hedge fund guy, making lots of money, and he quit to do these little web videos. And so we've moved, I'd say, about 160 IQ points from the hedge fund category into the teaching many people in a leveraged way category. So that was a good day, the day that his wife let him quit his job.
So you could imagine, I'm not, I was shaking when I saw this. I was, is this happening? Is this a dream? I was nervous. Those videos were for Nadia, not Bill Gates. And, I went home that night, and it was, it was still surreal. And I remember having dinner with my wife, and I said, what do I do now? Do I call him? Assuming he's not listed. And they left me in that limbo state for about 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, I'm in my walk-in closet. I'm about to record a video, and right then I see my cell phone rings. It's a Seattle number. I answer it. Hello, hi. This is Larry Cohen. I'm Bill Gates' chief of staff. You might have heard that Bill's a fan. Yeah, I heard that. And if you're free over the next few weeks, we'd love to fly you up to Seattle and learn more ways that we could work together. And I was looking at my calendar for the month. Completely blank. So yeah, I got to cut my nails, do some laundry, but I think I can meet with Bill. But we had that meeting, and it was strangely similar to the meeting with Ann. What would you do with more resources? I would internationalize it. We could reach millions or billions or students for a very long time, go across subjects and grades, et cetera, et cetera. At around the same time, some folks from Google also reached out. And so then all of a sudden, in fall of 2010, it all came together. Khan Academy was able to become a real organization, get office space, start hiring up a team to build the software that today amazing students like Jonathan have been able to use. And to understand kind of our core philosophy around learning, you might have heard these, Benjamin Bloom's mastery learning, which is really what we ended up implementing, or what I ended up kind of doing with my cousins, and to kind of appreciate what it's about. In a traditional academic model, the one that most of us grew up in, you group students together by age, and later on sometimes age and perceived ability, and you move them all together at a set pace. And what typically happens is kind of like a conveyor line, is that they're at one stage. Let's say we're in a middle school class, we're learning basic exponents. You get we have some lecture homework. Oh, something interesting's happened. We have some lecture homework on basic exponents, and then we have a test after 2 weeks. And let's say on that test, I get a 70%, you get an 80%, you get a 95%. Even though that we have identified gaps on that test. What was that 30% I didn't know? Even that A student, what was the 5% that she didn't know? The whole class then moves in lockstep onto the next concept. Probably a concept that's going to build on those gaps. It might be negative exponents, or fractional exponents, or logarithms, somehow expecting the student that didn't know 30% of the basic material to somehow master the more advanced one. And these gaps keep accumulating until at some point you get into an algebra class and nothing makes sense anymore, not because you're not bright or algebra is difficult, but because there's an exponent in that equation and you never learned that well. And to appreciate how absurd that is on some level, imagine if we did other things in our life that way. And I'll see if this thing, let's say home building. So you talk to the contractor and you say, we have 2 weeks to build a foundation, do what you can. So they do what they can. Maybe it rains, supplies don't show up. After 2 weeks, the inspector comes and says, okay, that part's not quite up to code. I'll give it an 80%. You say, great, that's a C. Let's build the first floor. Same thing. We have 3 weeks. Do what you can. And then after the inspector shows up, it's a 70%. Great, let's build the third floor. And then while you're building the third floor, the whole structure collapses. And if your reaction to that is the reaction we typically have in education, we said, well, maybe the contractor was the issue. Or maybe we needed more inspection. And maybe that's part of it. But what was really flawed was the process. You're artificially constraining how long and when to tackle something, pretty much ensuring a variable outcome, A, B, C, D, F, and then you take the trouble of identifying those gaps, but then you ignore them, and then you move on, and eventually those gaps become so debilitating that the whole structure collapses. Now, if we were here 50 years ago, you say, well, that's nice, Al, but how could you actually, if you let everyone flex when and how they learn something, how would you do it the logistics of 30 students in a classroom with one teacher? It would have been impossible. But what's exciting now is we do have the tools to do it. That's something that software is good at. That whether you're a student like Jonathan and they're learning at their own time and pace, or whether you're one of 30 students in a class, now we can give the teachers the tools and the students the tools so that they can all learn at their own time and pace. And so, one of the exciting things, one of the things that gets me up in the morning is to hear testimonials like Jonathan's, or we get them by email all the time. But also, we're pretty hard-nosed about measuring efficacy. And one of the most exciting partnerships we've had, and you're going to hear a lot more about it today, is David Coleman, and he really gets the bulk of the credit for this, reached out to Khan Academy about 3 years ago and says, look, we have to address the inequity around test prep, or at least the perceived inequity. And he says, we've been looking at y'all, and we like how y'all approach learning, especially around mastery learning, and the quality of what you're doing, and you're doing it for free in your nonprofit. And so we've collaborated together to make free test prep the best test prep for the world that happens to be free. And what's been especially exciting about it is the PSAT, which a bulk of American high school students take. In the past, it was just a random test in the 10th or 11th grade that gave you an indication of how you might do on the SAT, but that's all it was. But now when you take the PSAT, when the students get their score, there's a link, and if they click on that link, it syncs their account with Khan Academy. And now the PSAT acts as the world's largest personalized learning diagnostic. Because the software in Khan Academy will then know what your strengths and weaknesses are in math, and reading, and writing, and it can immediately do weak point training for you. And what you see on that first bullet point, we were able to do a study with the College Board following 250,000 students from their linking from the PSAT, doing the personalized practice, all the way through the SAT. And what we saw is that 20 hours of practice was associated with twice the expected gain that you would typically see from a student from 11th to 12th grade. So instead of a roughly 50, 60 point improvement, we were seeing 110, 120 point improvement. There are other studies. There was a big study in Idaho a few years ago where we saw something similar with 10,000 students, 80% more than expected gain. Another study that we're actually about to release about Brazil, where we saw, and this was a controlled study where we took the classrooms that swapped out 1 hour a week and they did personalized practice on Khan Academy. They saw 30% more gain than was expected. And so what's exciting about this is not just the efficacy studies, but it's the notion that we can even do efficacy studies like this now. That we can talk about hundreds of thousands or millions of students doing personalized practice, and that being able to measure how well it's working at a fairly granular level, which gives us confidence that, hey, this is helping, but it also allows us and the College Board to continuously improve what we're working on. So everything I've talked about so far is the world most of us live in. Some of you might be wondering, well, what about the rest of the planet? So these are all pictures of Khan Academy being used in other parts of the planet. Probably, and a lot of it is due to amazing work from other nonprofits going into the field. Probably the most exciting story here is the one in the top right. About 2 years ago, I got an email from the young girl in the top right. Her name is Zaya. And she sent a video testimonial. And in her video, she talks about using Khan Academy. She's in Mongolia. And using Khan Academy, and she loves math now. And I immediately assumed that she's middle class or upper middle class. Her English was quite good. She clearly had access to the internet. But then I read the text of her email more closely. And it turns out that there was a group of engineers from Silicon Valley who were going to Mongolia and setting up computer labs with internet in orphanages. And what you see in the top right, those are the orphan girls using Khan Academy, and Zaya was one of those orphans. And that by itself was like something out of a science fiction book, but what was even more incredible is Zaya eventually became one of the top contributors to Khan Academy in the Mongolian language. So she has now gone on to teach her people, so to speak. And a more recent story, this one's an incredible one that we were looped into about a year ago. So about 7 years ago, this young girl, Sultana, she was about 12, 13 years old. Taliban takes over her town, forbids all the young girls from going to school. I mean, it's horrible stuff, threatens them with acid attacks and whatever else. And so she doesn't go to school. She's lucky enough, she has a family member who gives her access to his laptop, and she has access to the internet. And so she teaches herself English over the internet, which is a little scary, but it worked for her. And she asked her relatives to get her any reading material she can get in English. And so a relative had gone to Pakistan, got a Time magazine that was in English, and then shows up, gives it to Sultana, and that Time magazine issue happened to have an article on Khan Academy in it. And so she immediately says, oh, is this possible? And then she goes on Khan Academy, and for the next 7 years, that becomes her education. She spends hours a day on it. She goes from, frankly, not even a middle school level, from an elementary school level, all the way to college level, calculus, physics, chemistry, biology, and she decides that she wants to be a physicist. And she wants to study and do research in the United States. And so she smuggles herself into Pakistan to take the SAT, because it's not offered in Afghanistan. It was a 30-hour illegal journey across one of the most dangerous borders in the world. She does surprisingly well. And then somehow she was in contact with an American student who was able to get in contact with us. This was about a year ago. We find out about her story, and then I Skyped with her. I was like, okay, we're going to try to figure out a way for you to come over here. Luckily, Kristof, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, also found out about Sultana, and he wrote this op-ed, "The Taliban's Worst Fear." And that allowed her to get political asylum. And she is now in the United States, and as we speak, she's doing physics research with one of the top physicists at MIT. And so, as you can imagine, English English in the U.S. is our core market, but we are trying to make sure that this type of thing is available to anyone on the planet. These are just some of the splash screens. And to kind of just get a sense of at least what the videos feel like in other languages, obviously it's not just videos, I'll show you this montage.
Me comi 2 quartos de pizza.
Hypoténuse commune, ok?
Si je t'aime, je vois.
और मैं इस हाथ से ब्लॉक को धकेलने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ इस डायरेक्शन में.
توجد قطعتين من معدن نحاس وزن.
پی آن به زبان دو سمتنه.
Perché rilascia baixo passivo, cioè la context magari fino.
Ele não é sequeleu na coisa.
Benim tanrısına gazeler. Ben
16 bölü 16 1'e eşittir.
Muitas e muitas outras coisas importantes.
Isaiah from Mongolia, wages are so interesting and funny, make more lessons.
I see. So these are just more pictures around the world of students learning on Khan Academy. And what I tell everyone involved, and to be very clear, and I appreciate Jonathan's thanks, but it's a much larger effort than me. We have a whole team at Khan Academy now. There's thousands of people who've helped volunteer, translate things. Obviously, the entire College Board team has been a big part of this. But I tell all the stakeholders, and all of y'all are really stakeholders in this together for this broader mission, is, I think we're at an inflection point where, there's a lot of things we're stressed about. There's self-driving trucks and automation and robots and where are all these jobs going to go and how are people going to navigate this? But there's also opportunities where the same technologies that might cause some of these tensions actually have a potential to actually help us as well. And to give a thought experiment, imagine going back in time 400 years to Western Europe, which even then was one of the more literate parts of the world. You would have seen that about 15% of the population was literate, about 20% of men and 10% of women. And I suspect that if you went to someone who was literate, say a member of the clergy, and you said, what percentage of the population do you think is even capable of reading? They might have said, well, with a great education system, maybe it's 30%, maybe 40%. Well, now we know today that would have been a wildly pessimistic prediction, that it's pretty close to 100% of the population is capable of reading. But if I were to ask any of y'all a similar question in today's terms, what percentage of the population do you think is capable of contributing to cancer research? What percentage of the population do you think is capable of being a physicist? What percentage of the population do you think could start the next Google or write the next great novel? You might say, well, today that's maybe 1%, maybe 5%, maybe 10% if you have a great education system. But what if that's just based on the blinders, the experience that we have from where we're all pushed lockstep, where we're all accumulating gaps, where we see either ourselves or our peers hit walls in algebra or genetics or calculus class? What if we are able to allow every student to essentially get a free personal tutor so that they can fill in their gaps? What if we have a world where every classroom can be liberated so that they can truly differentiate, like has been talked about in ed schools for decades now? In that world, I'm becoming increasingly optimistic that that number of people who could contribute to the knowledge economy isn't just 30 or 40 or 50%. I think it's 60, 70, 80, or even 90+%. And if we do that, I think it'll be really exciting, and this is really a collective effort, because we could take this thing called education that has always been scarce and expensive and not equally accessible to everyone, and make it just a lot more like clean drinking water or basic shelter and a fundamental human right. Thank you.